Welcome to Ohio Roots, the official podcast of the Ohio Genealogical Society. Join us as we embark on a captivating journey through Ohio's rich genealogy, history, and abundant resources. Hosted by me, OGS Executive Director Noel Poirier, this podcast brings you insightful conversations with a diverse array of guests, from OGS members, chapter leaders, and staff to renowned genealogists, historians, and influential figures within the genealogical community. Each episode delves into fascinating topics and captivating stories. So grab your headphones, hit that play button, and join us on this enthralling journey of Ohio's roots. Today's Ohio Roots guest is Krista Horrocks, the cemetery preservationist for the Ohio History Connection. Krista recently recorded a webinar with OGS, and I thought it would be great to have her on to discuss some of the interesting aspects of her efforts and all of our efforts at cemetery preservation. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Krista. Well, my guest today is Krista Horrocks. Krista is a cemetery preservationist for the Ohio History Connection. Thanks for being here today. You just finished a webinar for OGS a minute or so ago, almost literally. So I'm going to wear you out today. But thanks for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here. Love talking about cemeteries.
Well, one of the things I learned in your discussion today was that you started out as an archaeologist. Mm-hmm. Typically, when we start our podcast interview here, we ask people how they got started in their respective field, whether they were a genealogist or a librarian, or in your case, an archaeologist. What was it that lit the spark for you?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. It's kind of a funny story because I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
However, my parents are both amateur historians, big genealogists. You know, my sister and I, we got drug around to all the cemeteries as kids. Mm. I grew up in Fredericktown in Knox County, not too far from the OGS library.
Yeah.
And we have been there since my ancestors stepped off the boat. Okay. So we used to drive around and see all the local cemeteries, plant graves on our ancestors' graves. And I really think it just sunk in. I mean, as a kid, I didn't think much about it. Mm-hmm. Growing up, my sister and I both became professional historians. And then I just kind of started saying, I really like cemeteries. Okay. I found out about the Association for Gravestone Studies, which really kind of helped light the spark because I got to meet other people like me. And it just kind of all went from there. And once I joined the Ohio Historical Society, then I got the pleasure of finally being able to work with the public and share all my knowledge. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I think we tend to. Yeah, I think many of us don't think about cemeteries until we're very old. Yeah. Unless we're genealogists. Yeah. You talked about a lot of different cemeteries, and one of the things you mentioned today in speaking were some of the things that have happened with indigenous cemeteries and desecration and things like that. And I'm curious because with the recent designation of the Serpent Mound and those as UN sites, World Heritage sites, how does that play into our state and our community's relationship to these indigenous burial mounds, which those of us who understand Ohio history understand they're everywhere?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Yeah, our Hopewell ceremonial earthworks that got listed for World Heritage status. I think I think what it'll do is it'll really open up the opportunity for us to say as a state, some of these very important sites. I mean, we have such important sites that they became World Heritage sites. Sure. But yet we don't have very good burial protection laws in the state. Mm-hmm. Okay. Some states have had great burial protection laws for decades, for years, for hundreds of years. Some states like Indiana, right beside of us, they really, their cemetery preservation laws really started within the last 20, 25 years. Right. And it was a grassroots effort started by people like us who said, we should do better. We need to do more. Right. So I really hope, if nothing else, World Heritage status brings a focus on just how important our history is in the state, with cemeteries being our history. I mean, it's certainly included. And what's nice, and that's why I focus on my presentation about American Indian burial sites and cemeteries as you and I know them, historic Euro-American cemeteries, they're all the same thing under revised code. So they all deserve that level of protection, whether they're thousands of years old or 100 years old.
Right. And, it's funny, I can't remember his name, and I should. He's a historian and what I would consider at the time an amateur archaeologist at the turn of the 20th century, one of the founders of the Ohio Historical Society, who published the Archaeological Atlas of Ohio.
Oh, yeah, the Mills Atlas.
Yes, thank you. And going through that, I own a copy of it, and going through that atlas and seeing all those red dots, I live in Tuscarawas County, that he identified as burial or village sites, and just how prevalent they were, and how so many of them, I know certainly in my community, have simply gone away.
Yeah.
And I know my personal hope for things like the World Heritage Site designation is at least a recognition on the part of both Ohio citizens, but also on government entities, whether they're local or state, to make sure we're keeping an eye out for those kinds of things.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's no doubt that they're all over.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have a tendency to say, like, oh, there's a mound here, but it was destroyed.
Sure.
Farming, destroyed a lot of our early mounds, or early farming destroyed a lot of our mounds, and just development in general. But what's interesting archaeologically is there is a lot of times still, even mounds that have been leveled, so that the top part's gone, there's still archaeological evidence below ground of them. There's still important information, and sometimes there's even still burials that are under the main ground surface, because they buried people both below ground and in the mound themselves. So I think it's helpful for people to realize that, because it's easy to say, oh, that mound is gone, that mound is destroyed, when the archaeological evidence of that can still be there, which is still very valuable, even if it's not super, like, that's the thing about archaeology sites. They're below ground. So they're not up in your face like a historic building is, because, the historic buildings, they're right there. And that's great. But the archaeological evidence, that important, is hidden from us in our everyday lives. So it's easy to forget.
The hiddenness of it kind of brings me to a question that I wasn't thinking about asking until you mentioned it, was how is Ohio, or how are researchers using LIDAR today to locate not just indigenous burial areas, but maybe even European era burials in Ohio? Is that even something that's being looked at?
Oh, yeah. So LIDAR data is becoming a lot more publicly accessible now. And I can't tell you off the top of my head, unfortunately, but there's plenty of resources online where people can take, the actual LIDAR data and then feed it in through like GIS, and really change those. As you can tell, I'm not a LIDAR expert. Change the grading of the coloration and to bring out those highlights. So even using LIDAR, from a cemetery world, there's, we rely so much now on aerial mapping. Aerial mapping is fantastic compared to what it was 5, 10, obviously 20 years ago. So, but there's always cemeteries that are still hidden under, forest and things like that. And it's just not showing up through traditional aerial mapping. So it can be still hard to locate cemeteries when you don't have boots on the ground, because that's so much of what I do is research online. I don't have the opportunity to have boots on the ground for all 14,600 plus cemeteries in the state. So I'm doing as much as I can online, and LIDAR can actually, see through a lot of that tree cover and can find things like fence lines and even just, even I've heard the indentation of sunken burials or the small gravestones sticking up. So it really has some great potential. And it's interesting because there's even people out there that are, they're amateur historians, but they're very tech savvy, that are looking into some of this technology to help people like us that are professionals that might not have the time to spend, doing a lot of this research ourselves. So it's a great opportunity.
I really appreciated you're referencing a couple of Ohio Genealogical Society efforts that have been done in the past. But getting to your bigger point of boots on the ground, we have over 80 chapters of the Ohio Genealogical Society scattered across the state of Ohio, and those chapters are regularly looking at cemeteries and doing cemetery work. Is there a way? We do some of that on our own website, obviously consolidating that data and that information. But is there an outlet for all of that data other than the source, say like Find a Grave?
Yeah. So, Find a Grave is a great place. I always tell people, please upload, all of your information on Find a Grave, because that's going to hit the biggest, public source of that information. Our office, luckily, between early offices with the with our office and the Ohio Genealogical Society, when that Ohio Cemeteries 1803-2003 book came out, all of the data from that book was given to our office so that we could incorporate it into our online mapping system. So our online mapping system, which is not publicly available because it is used by state and federal agencies when they're checking to see if their projects could potentially affect cultural resources. And then it's also available to cultural resource professionals. So again, people that are doing work, helping developers, trying to make sure that, important cultural resources aren't affected. So that information can come to us through the State Historic Preservation Office. We oftentimes use information from the public and from cultural resource professionals that are out doing things like archaeological investigations, where they say, hey, you had this cemetery located here, but you're about 50 feet off, or you're 2 miles off, or it's here and not here. Because our data was really put together in the early 2000s based on the information that you guys were able to give us as an organization. But back then, we didn't have as good of aerial mapping as we do now. So we're constantly kind of moving around a lot of our cemetery data because it's just can be more visible now with the technology we have, but also people that have those boots on the ground that can tell us, where information is. And we do cross-reference websites like Find a Grave a lot of times if we're not sure where cemeteries are located. So that's definitely, our office. And again, we are working on getting our online mapping. Some of it will be available to the public. And when it is, that will include cemetery information and also things like National Register of Historic Places and things like that. So once that becomes publicly available, then that will be a reference that, people can utilize along with Find a Grave, just for people that are trying to double check and triple check maybe where a cemetery is located.
You mentioned in your presentation to webinar also references to African American cemeteries in Ohio, and I wanted to give you a chance to speak about that process and that progress and where we are in identifying. I mean, I know a lot of those communities, particularly those early Ohio African American communities, could be somewhat itinerant and would move about. They come to Ohio and then they go to Michigan and move around. How are you going about documenting those cemeteries and the information available in those?
Yeah. So I really started, I kind of did like a 4-step research project, and I used a lot of the references that I talked about in my webinar. So the very first thing I did was I used the Ohio Genealogical Society's Ohio Cemeteries 1803-2003, and I looked for keywords, words like African, African American, Black, things like that, that could indicate a cemetery just in the naming convention that it's African American. So that was kind of the easy step. That was the low-hanging fruit. The next step I did was I used the Works Progress Administration information. So their documentation, they had a tendency, at least in the state of Ohio, that when they were identifying an African American cemetery, they used the term colored, which I know is not appropriate by today's standards, but it's worth noting because that is a term that was used historically and can help with research efforts. So that has been a big help to identify cemeteries that they themselves identified as African American. And then just, pretty much the research that we have done has been what I just call desktop research. So I'm using online references. There's some really great books that have come out recently about these early Ohio African American communities where I can say, okay, I know based on this information, there is a community here where people lived, people died. So they have to be buried somewhere. So trying to track sometimes like community leaders, where were the leaders buried? Is it possible this could be an African American cemetery? And a lot of cemeteries that we have in the state were integrated. So even they're not necessarily exclusively African American, or maybe they started out as an African American cemetery, but then they became more inclusive to, the surrounding communities. So based on the African American Burial Grounds Preservation Act that the National Park Service will move forward when they get the funding for it, they have yet to define what is an African American cemetery. Okay. So the big thing about our efforts is we want to include anything and everything. So if there is a chance that a cemetery could be identified as African American, it's on our list. Okay. So really where we're at with next steps is at this point, we really need to start reaching out to descendant communities. Okay. We need the communities and their descendants to tell us these are the cemeteries that we consider to be part of our heritage and we consider to be African American cemeteries, because some of that's just not in historic records. Right. So that's really where we are. We do hope to have a lot of that information online so that people can specifically see which cemeteries we have identified as African American, and then we want the public to tell us what we missed. Well,
and I think that's a place where an organization like the Ohio Genealogical Society can be very helpful. We have obviously thousands of members all across the state of Ohio and the country of all differing backgrounds, and many of them have traced their roots through Ohio a lot, and certainly could be help illuminate those kinds of things. I think so. You hear that? Absolutely. You hear that? Everybody, get out there and let them know. Hi, this is OGS Executive Director Noel Poirier, and I'm cordially inviting you to stay home, put on your comfiest pajamas, and do not attend our annual no-show ball. That's right, no fancy clothes, no parking hassles, no small talk, just the satisfaction of supporting a great cause from the comfort of your couch. And what's on the agenda for this year's no-show ball? Absolutely nothing. No dinner to dress up for, no speeches to sit through, no dance moves required. But don't worry. While you enjoy your evening off, your generosity will be hard at work supporting the Ohio Genealogical Society. And this is how you do it. You stay home. You literally do anything else, and then you donate. And you can donate today at www.ogs.org/donate and use the 2024 No-Show Ball cause as your selection. No babysitter, no problem, no shoes, no problem. Thank you for not attending the No-Show Ball, but thank you for supporting the Ohio Genealogical Society. I live in the city of New Philadelphia, and I'm right down the street from the Fair Street Cemetery, which is one of the city's oldest cemeteries. And I walk past there every now and then, and I walk through it pretty regularly. And I think, I want to fix that or fix this. If somebody's thinking about, and I don't want to use the term adopting a cemetery, but wanting to work with a cemetery to improve, put headstones back in place and do what is the process? What advice would you give them for that?
Yeah, so the very first thing you want to do is find out who owns that cemetery. So is it privately owned? Is it township managed? Is it municipal managed? You really want to know who is legally responsible for taking care of the cemetery. You definitely do not want to go into a cemetery and just start doing your own thing. You can get charged for vandalism even if you think that you're doing the right thing. So you definitely want to find out who owns it. Once you find out who owns it, get in touch with them, talk to them, especially if it's like a township or municipal owned cemetery. Tell them, hey, I would love for us to do, let's have a cleaning day. Let's go and clean gravestones. Just try to work with them, feel them out, see if that's something they would be open to. I think, from my experience, a lot of townships and municipalities would love to have a group locally help them care for cemeteries. Some of the biggest, issues I hear about with municipal and township-owned cemeteries, they just don't have the funding. They're like, we're lucky to be able to cut the grass. That's about all we can manage. And I get it. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating that we don't have more support for them. So they would love somebody to come in and be able to do the things that they can't afford to do. So creating kind of that, like I call it a friends of group, find other like-minded people, get some training, get some good knowledge before you go in and start getting your hands too dirty. But doing something like a cleaning effort is really, pretty easy to do. It's affordable. A lot of people are interested in it. A lot of times you can get groups, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and groups like that can come in and help. People get excited about it. And sometimes just starting off with, it can be hard because some cemeteries are in really bad shape. And you go in there and it's easy to feel very overwhelmed. Like, oh, how am I ever gonna, fix all of this? And you just you have to think that just start, what's the first thing we can do? What's the first thing we can accomplish? And a lot of times cleaning is a good way to start. It helps build up people's interest in the cemetery when you actually get them in the cemetery, looking more closely at the gravestones and the care of them. Then they start going, oh yeah, let's do more. Let's start fundraising. Let's do this. So cleaning, also just the fact that cleaning can really just give, kind of make stones stand out more. Give them, giving anything a good cleaning makes it feel more important, right?
One of the things you talked about in your webinar was that there is a grant available for some cemeteries. I don't want to give away the whole thing. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah. So that is a grant that's offered from the Ohio Department of Commerce Division of Real Estate and Professional Licensing, who has the jurisdiction over active or registered cemeteries. So that grant started a few years ago, and it's I believe it's funded through burial fees. So it's like $1.25 of every burial in the state or something feeds into this grant. So it is a fluctuating amount every year. And I believe the goal of it is to try to, award as many cemeteries as possible. So they do, I do notice they have a tendency to mostly give like maybe $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 grants. So smaller amounts. But again, the grant is only available to active or registered cemeteries. So it has to be a cemetery that's registered with the Department of Commerce, and they are actively receiving burials or have done burials within the last 25 years. So it can help. It's for excessive maintenance. So maintenance that they don't have to do based on law, because there is certain maintenance activities they're required to do from law. But it's supposed to help with other things, or even help train their maintenance crew on proper cemetery maintenance practices, which is great. But yeah, I've seen people use it for fences. I have seen for gravestone restoration projects. Because even a lot of our active cemeteries have historic sections. So it is something that could be used to restore gravestones, even though it isn't out there for cemeteries that aren't registered or active.
You mentioned there are certain things that active cemeteries are required to do. Is there a place where a third party could find out what those things are? Because I hear a lot from some of our members who go to cemeteries a lot that they feel, whether it's reality or not, they feel that the cemetery is not being cared for by the responsible party. And is there a place where those folks can go and see what is required of a cemetery, an active cemetery, to do in terms of maintenance and care? And then if that's not really being done, is there a process through which that can be reported by somebody?
Yeah, so there is, it's called minimal maintenance requirements, and it is, I believe, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, I believe it's actually published through that Ohio Cemetery. Oh gosh, I always put it in the presentation.
Put you on the spot. That's okay.
I can't remember. The cemetery commission that can help deal with issues with cemeteries, with active cemeteries. So it's in revised code so it is available online. I mean, as I always tell people, I'm happy to send you a link to it. If you would like to share with your group. It is, I'll tell you, it's pretty minimal. I mean, it really is. It really is. A lot of it really doesn't have a lot to do with the gravestones themselves. It has to do with lawn maintenance and things like that. So again, when a lot of people say a cemetery is being neglected, it's because a lot of times they'll see gravestones that have fallen over time and things like that. So it is pretty minimal. And if you are in an active or registered cemetery and you believe they are not meeting those requirements, that is something you can report to the cemetery commission. And again, they're not a like a lawyer, or they're not a will do as I say organization. They simply act as a third party for the applicant, the person who's complaining, essentially the complaint, and then the cemetery to try to work out the issue. So.
And one of the things you talked about, I said I was listening. One of the things you talked about in your webinar was the idea of desecration and vandalism. And that every state and every principality, really locality, can have a different rule regarding what that means. There does seem to have, there sometimes is the public impression that that's on an increase of desecration and vandalism. Whether it is or not, and it just happens to be reported and we all get shocked or not, is a whole other issue.
Right.
But what is Ohio? Where does Ohio stand on those kinds of things legally compared to, say, other states?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have very good protection laws in the state. So we say human burial protections, and that goes two ways.
Right.
So that goes both for the protection of human remains themselves, and for the associated grave goods, which in this case would qualify like as a gravestone, as an associated grave good. So most desecration that we see is happening. Through vandalism, right? And I agree, is this something that's more prevalent now, or do we just hear about it more?
Right, sure.
I believe it's probably, we just hear about it a lot more. But very, I would say, blatant examples of vandalism, spray painting. We see that, unfortunately, a lot. We see people going in and knocking over gravestones.
Right.
That is, by definition, vandalism, right? So that's pretty enforceable, I would say, legally. It's that neglect is where we really get into sort of dicey territory. A cemetery that's on private property that is not active or registered, there really is no laws that we have that require any level of maintenance. So we see that neglect as being pretty rampant.
Right.
People that, say, oh yeah, there's that cemetery in my back 40 and whatever. It's just there. They're not destroying it. They're not going in and backhoeing it or destroying the gravestones. It's just simply sitting back there and being neglected. So we don't really have any regulations that stop that from happening. A lot of states do. A lot of states, Louisiana actually has some of the best cemetery preservation laws in the country. And that's because for them, their cemeteries are tourist attractions. Right. So they've made a huge effort to protect their cemeteries. A lot of New England and the East Coast, where they have those really, really old 1700 cemeteries, a lot of those have a high level of protection. They're very, very, very old cemeteries. We just don't, unfortunately, have that here in Ohio. There hasn't been there has been attempts in the past to do better protections, specifically around, again, focusing on human burial remains. So if you guys have heard of like the NAGPRA laws, the NAGPRA laws, the protection of American Indian remains is a federal law, but it only applies in very, very select situations and not usually situations that we actually see come up like in real life. So yeah, it's hard. It's a hard topic, but having more people aware of cemeteries and watching over and caring for cemeteries is the best thing we can do, aside from having the laws in place.
Well, if you thought that question was hard, you're going to hate this one. So I write a lot of local history here in Tuscarawas County. And I wrote a story not too long ago about a gentleman named John Rawl, who was buried, died in 1881, and was buried. He was only in his 40s, early 40s. His grave was robbed, and the robbers were caught in the process of doing it. And it led to Cleveland and where they sold the corpse, and there's a whole bunch of different people involved. Doesn't matter. But what it raised to my mind when I wrote that story and was researching it was, how many graves are empty that we don't know about?
That's a good question.
Because it seemed like it was a pretty regular practice in that era, enough that funeral parlors in New Philly, at least, were selling grave robbing proof, graves. And I know it's kind of a weird thing to talk about. But as I walk through gravestones now, I'm like, I wonder if they're actually under there.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And just to, I guess, reiterate, these corpses were being sold mostly for medical purposes. Right, exactly. So, and really what, to my understanding, I'm no expert on this topic, but it's my understanding what sort of did away with that was when we did start having regulations around the ability for people to donate their bodies to science. And I'm sure that came, not soon enough based on all these stories. I will say this, I would assume that much like today, these are the stories that always made the headlines.
Of course.
Right. So I think we feel like it's a pretty rampant problem historically, whether it actually was or not.
Right.
I can't say. I'm sure it's very locational based.
Sure.
Places like I know Green Lawn out here in Columbus has a lot of stories around this topic.
Of course.
But if you had a medical facility nearby, it was probably happening more than in rural Ohio, where nobody's going to cart the body like 2 days.
Well, that's how these two young men got caught.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah.
So but saying that, and I mentioned this in my presentation, the Victorians loved to dig up their loved ones and move them around.
Right.
It happened way more historically than it does now. I think now we just, it's usually a pretty extreme case to actually, take a body out of the ground and move a vault and a casket and all that jazz.
Sure.
But back then they really, and really this came from the rural cemetery movement.
Mm-hmm.
These urban cemeteries that were really starting to be overrun. They were they're overpopulated.
Right.
They were becoming what the community considered health hazards. And we see it a lot here in Columbus. Some like Columbus's 5 original cemeteries really were, completely obliterated for the rural cemetery movement. When Green Lawn came in and Union Cemetery and some of our bigger ones, people said, I don't want my loved one buried here. This cemetery looks like crap. It's, there's cows running and pigs running around and it smells or whatever. So they would, disinter their loved ones and take them out to nicer cemeteries. And back then it's like you dug the people up yourself.
Yeah, right.
So it wasn't like now it's a whole permitting process and everything. So, that does definitely lead to the potential of, empty grave sites.
Sure.
Though in theory, people probably for the most part took their gravestones with them if they were actually doing it in the time. But yeah, that's a good question. And we.
Oh, it wasn't a good question. No, it was just a fun one I had to ask.
A funny one. I will say, luckily, hopefully, we will never know the answer to it. And the reason we'll never know the answer to it is because we don't want to go digging up people in cemeteries. We want cemeteries to stay where they are. We want to preserve them. We want to leave the bodies at rest. So hopefully we'll never know the answer.
Good. Well, Krista, thank you so much for joining me today on the Ohio Roots podcast. It's a lot of fun talking to you. Appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye. What a great and fun conversation. I appreciate Krista's willingness to come on the podcast today, talk about her work, and put up with my attempts at humor. I also hope that you enjoyed hearing all that she had to say. Thank you again to Krista for being such a great guest, and thank you for listening to the Ohio Roots podcast.
The Ohio Roots podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Genealogical Society, the premier gateway for discovering your Ohio family history. Hosted by OGS Executive Director Noel Poyer and edited by Luke Poyer. Theme song is Beautiful Ohio, recorded by Bob Stanley and his orchestra in 1944. To learn more about joining the Ohio Genealogical Society, visit www.ogs.org.